Hello. In today's video, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite moments in history, the Civil Rights Movement. Um, when I said in the earlier videos that the best example of the church was the early church, before it got corrupted by paganism and the Catholic Church, or divided with the Great Schism between the Orthodox and Catholics, there is another case of a really, really good church that I'm going to talk about in this video. But before that, you got to understand just how bad Jim Crow had it for these people. I mean, you've heard about it in school. You've seen it in the history that the United States education system does teach us, because it's actually one of the things they include, unlike many other things. But it was terrible for these people. They were literally second class citizens. They were taking the worst jobs if they were able to get a job, and they lived in poverty. And the segregation, it made society just completely dehumanize these people, and we should never do that. But it wasn't a movement of just African Americans or Latinos. A lot of your white Americans were also getting involved with this movement, and that's what the planning, the church work, and everybody getting involved is what allowed this civil rights movement to go as well as it did. And it's much better than talking about the Cold War or the World Wars. So to start, they had to desegregate the schools, because at the time they were under Jim Crow laws, which is separate but equal, but in reality it wasn't equal because they weren't maintaining the infrastructure that they provided for the African American and Latino American communities. And so they were the people involved in the first part of the movement. Well, it started back while Teddy Roosevelt was in power, with like people like Booker T. Washington being like, well, we can just try to educate ourselves with what we have and show them that, we are just as capable. But that didn't work. And so now they would make legal moves trying to desegregate schools, with cases like Plessy v. Ferguson or Brown versus Board of Education, which Brown versus Board of Education was actually a combination of like 5 different cases, but it was just that Brown versus Board of Education alphabetically came first, so that's what we know it as. But there are many heroes, which is not something I've really mentioned in the last couple videos over history, because a lot of history is terrible. But there's also good. Where there has been evil in history, there has also been great good. And this is one of those examples. You got people like, A. Philip Randolph, or Earl Warren, or, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, all these great activists. And so when they finally got the segregation ended in schools, the people who supported Jim Crow laws, it didn't exactly go about in the way they thought, like timing-wise, because the people who supported Jim Crow simply closed down all the schools and only opened the private schools and gave tuition to the white American students. Incredibly racist, incredibly discriminatory, and really just, trying to resist the morally right way of the law as much as possible. But when the schools did eventually open back up, you have people like, trying to remember, I think it's like Rosie Bridges was named. It was like a lot of these kids are getting escorted by like National Guard or, people to help guard them, because of the amount of, like, I guess protest or slightly persecution that they would face in society. And then, with the forming of the NAACP, you had more activists rising up, such as Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was not just some random lady who decided to not give up her seat to a white person. She was an activist in the NAACP. She was a really strong activist in the movement. And the amount of discrimination they had to face was incredible, because discrimination is the nonviolent persecution. It's the dehumanizing of people, and it's prejudice against people. And so when I think of people like Emperor Nero, who literally went after killing Christians, and I think of people like the people who set up the Jim Crow laws, I think of them as the same. They're both evil in their own ways. They're both trying to persecute, whether it be physically or just mentally. It's still just as evil. But the greatest example of a church in the last 100 years has to be the church that Martin Luther King Jr. led. Oh, and Martin Luther. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. One of the best examples of a church. Because during this time, when you had all the prosperity gospel and evangelical people rising up, they would care less about, being the hands and feet of Jesus, and they would just care about getting as many people to quote unquote repent to Jesus and turn their lives to Christ without actually being disciples to him. But when you have a church like the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, you have a community such as the African American community. They're all poor, by the way, but they're able to contribute enough tithes to fund a lot of the lawsuits and the legal battles and a lot of the protests that happened during this time. And that really is what the church is for. You're supposed to gather in community. You're supposed to discuss modern issues and how you can overcome them together as a community. And I think Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is really one of the best examples because of what it helped to create. Boycotts were led against, like, the bus industry that was incredibly racist, making African Americans sit at the back, and if there was no room because a white person came in, they would have to give up their seat. And it was terrible. It was very discriminatory, very persecution in a way. And you also had people like the Ku Klux Klan who were against these people, and they were actually doing persecution. I mean, you have fire bombings on the Freedom Rides, or, other cases of them going to, kidnap black people, burn them at their Klan meetings, and just the terrible things they've done to those people. But it wasn't like the police were any better, because in Alabama, just like literally from 1945 to 1963, there were more than 50 racially motivated bombings since World War. That's what I had in the book, is since World War II. But yeah, between 1945 and 1965. That's in the span of less than, it was about a span of 20 years, and that's an insane amount of persecution that these people faced. It goes to show the courage and the faith of these people. I mean, it wasn't just a church or an organization like the NAACP, but it was literally you get to the March on Washington, it was literally over 250,000 protesters. That's how many people were fighting for what was right. That is a great example of what we should be. And so as a result, with cooperation from JFK and, Congress, they got the Civil Rights Act of 1963 passed, and it didn't end racism necessarily, but it paved the way for the ending of it. And then you have, another example of civil rights was women's suffrage. And this one I feel a little bit different on. Not that it was a bad idea. It was a great idea. In fact, the first two waves of women's rights were great. Just as the first two waves of civil rights. You had people like Jane Addams, pushing for women's suffrage and the ability to vote. You had people like Betty Friedan, I think that's how you say her name, writing books about misogyny and the issue that was going on at the time. Because, you get to the 1950s and 60s and you get this traditional kind of marriage setup of a husband goes to work, comes home, and the wife does all the chores and everything around the house, has no life, basically. And that's not how it should be. You should never be subject and slave to a house. You should have the choice. The idea of marriage is that two become one. And so how are you going to do that if you divide yourself in this way that they did with the traditional marriage setup? But I also have to make this video because of the third wave of civil rights in women's suffrage. Because there is a point when you can push something too far. Now, is there still racism and misogyny in the world? No doubt, there definitely is. But it's definitely not anything that affects you legally. It's not anything that should affect you. And if it does, that should be reported, and it should be, the authorities should deal with it. Now, given in those times when they were fighting for civil rights in the first two waves, the police weren't doing anything. They were siding with the discriminators. They were being terrible people. But nowadays, I think we have learned enough as a society to not fall into that way. But some people still do, because you got some people playing the victim of, oh, is it because I'm black, or oh, is it because I'm a woman? That's not healthy either. And with this third wave of feminism, where you have movements like "kill all men," no, it's that's taking the pendulum and swinging it the complete other direction from what it needs to be. You need to balance it. It's a balance of civil rights that needs to be had. You can't push one too far the other way, otherwise you're going to end up being like the people who were discriminating against you, who were persecuting against you. And that's one reason I don't really support, like, everything about DEI and LGBT. It's not that the ideas are bad. It's that you push it too far. It's the way you go about it. The way MLK Jr. and Rosa Parks and other activists went about the civil rights movement was a more than enough correct way to do it. In fact, that was the best way to do it. But to continue with that same kind of hammer and strength is not necessarily good when the society isn't the way it used to be. But I love talking about the civil rights movement. I love talking about how the church was best used, which was helping during modern issues, helping everybody have the chance that they should. Everybody should be loved. Everybody should be accepted into a church, and they give them the chance to repent and turn their lives around for Jesus. And discrimination it's a terrible way to go about it. It's almost as if they were still upholding some of the Jewish laws, which during the times that the Jewish laws were, I guess, in place before they were amended by Jesus, I would say that they had reason. The people foreign to Israel at the time were sacrificing children, doing all these idol worship to people like Baal. That is understandable. You obviously don't want to be in a culture like that. That's like, staying away from communism and some of the evils that come with a dictatorship. It's the same thing. There's a point where you got to ask yourself, are you playing the victim or are you playing the hero? Because the hero isn't just a victim. The hero is standing for purpose, standing for truth and reason, not just comfortability and, ease. They're actually fighting for truth. And I feel like a lot of people, they need to rest. They've won the battle. Christ has already won the battle, and America has already won the battle against civil rights. If some people won't accept it, that's their problem. They can take that up with God on Judgment Day. We will know what happens to them if they continue with their ways. But at some point, the sword must be laid down. Not in every area. There are still incredibly racist areas in the United States, and you should definitely continue fighting for civil rights in those areas. And there's still groups of people out there that are incredibly racist and should be condemned for what they do. But I want to point out a Pacific verse, which is, vengeance is the Lord's. And at this point, that's all we can say as, people fighting for those civil rights and those equal rights for men and women, is that at this point, it's in the Lord's hands. We passed the laws. Most of us have changed the society. If there are those still left behind in the old ways, it's their free will. They're going to suffer a lot because, sin always has an effect. Whether today or tomorrow, whether to you or to somebody else, sin always has an effect. And if they want to continue sinning, it's going to affect their lives. Don't be a part of their lives. Let them fall. Because sometimes it's when the proud are brought down that they become humble and they become righteous. And sometimes it's what you need to let happen for these people. Continuing to put on the same show and fight is almost, egging them on. It's stirring the pot. It's doing something we don't need to do. We can be at peace with knowing that, legally we're equal and morally we're equal. And if, some people don't view it that way, they're the ones who need help. They're the ones who need Christ the most. But it's only by their free will. So we can try to be lights. We can hope that they see the light. But if they're blind, I don't know if they can. Maybe it'll be a wake-up calling from their lives falling apart. So, yeah, that was today's video. Be the hands and feet of Jesus. God bless you, and have a great day.